Whether it's out at an archaeological site or deep in the archives of government records, the answers to some of history's strangest mysteries can still be found. Every year, new mysteries are solved, but sometimes these solutions only lead to stranger mysteries. Number 10. Hundreds of shipwrecks lie off the coast of Brazil. Many of these could tell stories which have not yet been told. But when a fisherman got his net caught on something on the sea floor in 2011, he didn't realize it was anything significant. It was actually the trigger that would solve a Brazilian World War II mystery. The Vital de Oliveira is the only Brazilian Navy vessel to be sunk by the enemy during the war. Brazil joined World War II on the side of the Allies in 1942. The country sent soldiers to Europe and became a second hub for the US. The Vital de Oliveira was put into action. It had previously been a civilian ship, but had military experience before the war. In 1911, she'd been requisitioned by the Brazilian Navy to move troops to Paraguay. The ship was returned to her owner after the fighting, but was requisitioned again in the 1930s. When Brazil joined World War II, the Vital de Oliveira was put to work, transporting troops and supplies around the coast. It performed the job well until the attack of July 20th, 1944. It was the early hours of the morning when the ship was torpedoed by German U-boat U-861. The ship sank in a matter of minutes. There was an escort ship with the Vital de Oliveira, which tried to chase after the U-boat. It had to turn around, though, and help rescue the men now fighting for their lives in the Atlantic Ocean. There were 275 men on board when the ship was hit. Only 175 would be rescued. It was one of the biggest losses during the war for the Brazilian Navy. It wasn't the only ship sunk during the war, though. 2 others had been lost, but these were due to accidents. One was lost in a storm in 1944, and the other during training the following year. In the decades after the war, many searches were made to try to locate the vessel. Unfortunately, the task proved impossible. Hundreds of wrecks from the World War II period were found, but none were the famous Vital de Oliveira. That changed in 2011. A fisherman working off the coast of Rio de Janeiro got his net caught on something on the sea floor. He contacted his pair of brothers for help, but they couldn't get the net loose, and they knew they needed a deep-sea diver for assistance. Domingos Afonso Jorio was called in for help. He realized that the net was caught on a cannon, which was part of an undiscovered shipwreck, and called the Brazilian Navy to report the find. For over a decade, the men heard nothing about the ship, but in January of 2024, the Navy made a remarkable announcement. It had investigated the find, locating the wreck with the help of local divers. It was found roughly 50 miles off the coast of Mackay, in roughly the same area that the Vital de Oliveira had sunk. Images had been captured using a multi-beam echo sounder and side cannon sonar. These mapped out the sea floor in the area. They returned images that clearly showed the wreck, apparently still mostly intact on the ocean bed. While the images may look grainy and unspecific to the trained eye, the Navy search teams knew what they had found. After 80 years, the Vital de Oliveira had been located. The Navy plans to use the images from the scans to create 3D models of the sunken ship. In the future, technical dives and remotely operated underwater vehicles may be used to capture more photos and videos of the wreck, to uncover more of this historic story. Number 9. Sometimes the answers to historical mysteries are known, but locked in archives and hidden away from the rest of the world. In 2018, researchers uncovered one such answer to a Vietnam War mystery. It was August 4th, 1972, and the US military pilots were monitoring the waters off the coast of North Vietnam. Earlier that summer, the military had conducted Operation Pocket Money, a mining campaign that made getting in and out of North Vietnamese harbors extremely dangerous. But on that morning, the pilots watched as dozens of mines detonated almost instantaneously. There wasn't a ship in sight, and the cause for the mysterious detonation remained a mystery. Over the following weeks, military personnel tried to get to the bottom of the mystery and even contacted staff at the precursor to NOAA's Space Weather Prediction Center. The outcome of the investigation was filed away in a classified report. News of the mystery didn't travel far, and it seemed destined to become one of the many forgotten events of the war. But a postdoctoral fellow at NOAA remembered the strange meetings, and decades later would mention the story to Colorado engineering professor Dolores Knipp, who decided to get to the bottom of the mystery. She discovered that the military had connected the strange event to another almost forgotten one. On August 4, 1974, a large solar storm hit the Earth. It set off sensors around the planet and those orbiting the planet on satellites. In Europe, auroras were seen as far south as Spain. In the US and Canada, telephone and telegraph outages were reported. Scientists in the Philippines, Brazil, and Japan all reported magnetic disturbances. At the time, scientists in the US didn't believe the event was anything too out of the ordinary. Solar storms hit the Earth every year, and most of them don't cause too many problems for life here. This storm was notable due to how fast it had been. It reached the Earth in less than 15 hours, but other than that, it didn't seem too remarkable. But as Knipp and her colleagues looked at the data again in 2018, they realized that this was the most intense storm of the space age. In fact, it may have been a Carrington-class event. The Carrington event was the biggest solar storm event in recorded history. It took place in 1859. Witnesses at the time reported being able to read by the light of the auroras, telegrams working even when the machines were unplugged, and operators being shocked by static electricity. The 1976 storm was far closer to the Carrington event than anybody at the time realized. Scientists on the south side of the Earth facing towards the sun reported solar energetic particles and X-rays that surpassed anything they had seen before. One analysis concluded that if astronauts had been on their way to the moon at the time of the event, it would have cost them their lives. Multiple satellites were damaged, and one suffered a mission-ending power failure. Back on Earth, deep beneath the sea, the solar storm hit the mines off the coast of Vietnam. These mines were designed to be detonated by changes in the magnetic fields caused by the largely iron ships passing in their vicinity. But the solar storm also caused dramatic shifts in the magnetic field. Military experts hadn't been sure if space weather could have an impact so deep underwater, but now they had their answer. Number 8. Southwick is a small town in West Sussex, England, and the last place most would expect a Cold War mystery to come from. But in 1956, an experimental RAF flight ended with a crash that's been shrouded in mystery ever since. It was about 1 p.m. on May 11, 1956. In Southwick, children from the Manor Hall Road Junior Boys School were making their way home. People were settling down for their midday meals. The quiet of a typical Friday afternoon would be shattered by the noise of an approaching RAF Vickers Valiant B-1. This type of aircraft was designed for the Cold War. It could travel at high speed and was designed to travel into the Soviet Union to drop atomic weapons if the Cold War ever became hot. The Valiant had gone into service the previous year, and the one flying towards Southwick that afternoon was nearly new. It had taken off from Farnborough Airfield, about 40 miles north, on an experimental test flight. On board were pilot Kenneth Orma, co-pilot Colin Donald Preece, navigator Kenneth Evans, and civilian experimental engineer Alan Knight. As it approached Southwick at a low altitude, the plane suddenly dropped from the sky. It very narrowly avoided the train station and school, hitting the earth in a recreation field. Debris was scattered nearly half a mile from the crash site. Only the co-pilot managed to survive the crash. He ejected and was still attached to his seat when it crashed into the station ticket office. The 3 other men on board couldn't escape in time and lost their lives in the crash. Thankfully, nobody on the ground was seriously hurt, though some houses were severely damaged by the wreck. As work began on rebuilding the homes and clearing up debris, rumors began to spread about what had caused the crash. The purpose of the experimental flight was top secret, which only led to more wild theories. Some thought that the crash was the work of spies. The truth would be hidden in classified documents for decades before finally being uncovered by research by the Southwick Society. The cause of this mysterious crash was a simple electrical problem. While on its test, the crew had run into instrument trouble. That alone shouldn't have been too much of a problem, but they needed to return to base. Unfortunately, they had too much fuel to land safely at Farnborough, which was undergoing runway repairs at the time. The pilot needed to burn off fuel before attempting to make a landing, and was flying between the towns of Chelsea and Brighton to do so. If they were looking for it, the people of Southwick would have spotted the Valiant passing back and forth overhead multiple times before the crash. As the fuel burn-off was done, it's believed that someone on board tried to reset the circuit breakers on the test equipment. Suddenly, the plane lost all electrical power as it was on a turn. The flight controls failed, and the plane became impossible to control. Orman ordered the crew to eject, but only his co-pilot was able to make it out in time. Number 7. In 1974, the United States launched a satellite that was supposed to help keep calibrated ground-based monitors. Unfortunately, the equipment didn't deploy properly, and not long afterward, scientists lost track of it. In May of 2024, analysts finally found the mysterious satellite again. Between 1971 and 1986, the United States successfully launched 19 KH-9 hexagon reconnaissance satellites into orbit. The main purpose of these satellites was to send images back to the Earth and help the United States determine the military capabilities of the Soviet Union. One of these satellites, the KH-9-8, was carrying more than just cameras. The S-73-7 infrared calibration balloon was a piggyback payload. It was designed to be detected by sensing arrays back on Earth and help calibrate them. But when the S-73-7 was pushed from the main satellite, the balloon didn't inflate properly. There was no way it could fulfill the job properly, and it became just another piece of space junk. For a while, scientists back on Earth kept track of the failed satellite. Even though it wasn't doing anything useful, it's important to keep track of everything in orbit around Earth. Anything orbiting the planet is moving at speeds of thousands of miles an hour to counteract the force of gravity. If anything like this made contact with a functioning satellite or anything else moving through the area, it could have disastrous consequences. Even if two pieces of space junk only collided with one another, that would likely produce more debris, which would just increase the possibility of something else being hit. Unfortunately, not long after S-73-3's failed launch, analysts back on Earth lost track of it. It was possible that the satellite had simply fallen out of orbit and burned up in our atmosphere, but it was just as likely that the satellite was still out there, hidden from sensors. Its relatively small size and the fact that it was mostly made up of non-metallic material would make it hard to track. Even larger satellites can be hard to keep track of. Normally, scientists rely on information about the launch and where the space object is expected to be to work out where they actually are and what satellite individual data points relate to. But with the failed deployment of the S-73-3, the launch information wouldn't be especially helpful, making it that much harder to track. For a few years in the 1990s, the mysterious satellite appeared again. It had dropped in altitude, but not significantly. But after briefly reappearing, the satellite vanished again. It wasn't until 2024 that the S-73-3 appeared on data gathered by the US Space Force. In April of that year, astrophysicist Jonathan McDowell announced the rediscovery. An analyst had spotted the small balloon on sensor data still orbiting the Earth, as it had been for over 50 years. It's even still roughly at the same altitude, only dropping by roughly 9 miles from the original 500-mile altitude. Exactly how the analysts managed to determine that the data corresponded with the S-73-3 isn't exactly clear. There are over 20,000 objects in orbit over the Earth, and many are not identifiable, but scientists are certain that this is the failed calibration balloon. Number 6. Understanding a long-forgotten language can be the key to unlocking many secrets and mysteries from ancient times. When the Rosetta Stone was discovered, it helped Egyptologists understand ancient hieroglyphs, unlocking a wealth of information about people who lived thousands of years ago. In 2023, archaeologists uncovered clay tablets written in a never-before-seen language. It didn't take long for the writing to be deciphered. Even though what was actually written wasn't of much interest, the discovery could help historians solve more mysteries in the future. Hattusha was the capital of the Hittite Empire during the Late Bronze Age, making it one of the most important hubs in the region. The Hittites were a powerful empire. It controlled much of Anatolia, and the empire encompassed many different people groups that all had their own languages. For about 100 years, archaeologists have been working at Hattusha, uncovering new discoveries every year. Roughly 30 to 40 clay tablets or fragments are revealed each year, mostly written by scribes for the empire's civil services. The clay tablets are covered in cuneiform writing, wedge shapes pushed into clay to represent syllables. Cuneiform is the oldest writing system in the world and has been understood by historians since the 1850s. The writing system didn't begin with the Hittites. It actually originated in Sumer, but had spread around the Mediterranean during the Bronze Age. The Hittites used it to write their own language. When they needed to write in the language of other people, cuneiform was used, even if those people had never used the system before. Unsurprisingly, most of the tablets contain writing in the Hittite language. But over the years, archaeologists have uncovered some writing in other languages spoken within the empire. It was only a small collection of these tablets that archaeologists uncovered writing in a language they'd never seen before. Scholars determined that this mysterious writing was Kalasma or Kalasmaic. This was a language spoken by the people of Kalasma, a region on the northern edge of the Hittite Empire. The Hittites were in control of the region at various times, and the tablets uncovered show one way they attempted to integrate the Kalasma people into their empire. After the tablets were deciphered, it was revealed that they contained details of religious practices for worshipping the Kalasma gods. The Hittites would incorporate the gods of other regions into their belief systems, but believed these gods wouldn't necessarily know the Hittite language. Worship had to be done in minority languages, which is why the information was recorded in those languages. This practice helped to preserve Kalasma, and may have helped to preserve many other languages in the region. Number 5. On December 23, 1948, Hideki Tojo and 6 other war criminals lost their lives at Sumago Prison in Tokyo, Japan. For the next 70 years, what happened to their remains was one of Japan's biggest World War II mysteries. It was only in 2021 that the mystery was solved. Hideki Tojo had served as the Prime Minister of Japan from 1941 to 1944. He'd previously been Minister of the Army and was one of the leading voices in Japan's wartime expansion. He was also blamed for many of the atrocities committed by the Japanese military during the war, especially against people in China and Southeast Asia. Japan's war effort had started off strong, but by 1944, it was clear the country was on the back foot, and people were growing frustrated with those in charge. Tojo no longer had the support of Emperor Hirohito, and he was forced to resign. The resignation didn't change Japan's fate in the war. Just over a year later, atomic weapons were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Japan surrendered to the US. Tojo tried to take his own life, but was captured by US troops to stand trial for war crimes. Between 1946 and 1948, 28 Japanese wartime leaders stood trial in the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. Tojo, like the others, pleaded not guilty. The judge found him guilty of waging wars of aggression and ordering inhumane treatment of prisoners of war, among other offenses. He and 6 other criminals would lose their lives for their crimes. After the criminals lost their lives, the media tried to follow trucks taking the remains to the crematorium. The vehicles managed to shake off their pursuers, but that didn't stop photographers from showing up at the crematorium after the procedure was completed. Where the ashes were taken after this remains a mystery. There were rumors that Tojo and the others had been taken to an American military cemetery, and the ashes were scattered in a swampy area, but the truth was kept a secret. The US were worried that supporters of Tojo would use his final resting place as a rallying point. Even today, Tojo remains a controversial figure in Japan. For some, he was a patriot. He's even named on the Yasukuni Shrine, which is dedicated to all the Japanese people who lost their lives for the country since 1869. Others see Tojo as a representative of the atrocities Japan committed during the war. Without a definitive answer, the case remained a mystery for decades, but the truth would come out in 2021. Nihon University lecturer Hiroaki Takazawa had been doing research into the trials of other war criminals when he came across declassified documents in the U.S. National Archives in Washington, D.C. The documents included statements by those who'd witnessed the cremation and the scattering of the remains. They described how the remains of each of the men were placed in separate urns and loaded onto an aircraft. They were then flown to a point over the Pacific Ocean, roughly 30 miles east of Yokohama, Japan's second largest city. The remains of each man were then scattered over a large area. According to Takezawa, the personnel involved took care to make sure that not even the smallest particles were left behind. The reports made it clear that there was no way Tojo's remains could be found, but the 70-year-old mystery could now be classified as solved. Number 4. History is full of stories of lost cities. These were places that once held great significance in the region, but for one reason or another were abandoned and lost to history. Some of the stories of lost cities are nothing more than legends, but every now and again, archaeologists uncover evidence that there may be truth behind some of the stories. In 2024, a team of archaeologists working in the United Arab Emirates revealed they believe they discovered one of these mysterious lost cities. In early Islamic geographical writing, there were many mentions of an important city and region somewhere on the Gulf Coast. The city of Tuam was famous for its pearl fishing and precious gem trade. It was recorded as a local capital, but also that it encompassed many small villages. It may have been an early version of an emirate, something like a powerful city surrounded by hinterland that went by the same name. Tuam got its start sometime around the 4th century, but reached its peak in the 6th century. Unfortunately, the people of Tuam were some of the many victims of the plague of Justinian. Regional fighting also made it difficult to live in the area, and the city was abandoned. Later writers would record that the city was a jumping-off point for Arab people moving into the southeast region of Arabia, making it an important location for the history of the region. But even though these historical writers went into great detail about the location of the city, modern archaeologists have struggled to find any matching settlement. In 2021, a large development project was announced for the Sinai Island of the UAE. The aim was to draw tourists to the region, but the family in charge of that area wanted to ensure that any potential historic sites would be preserved, leading to more archaeological work on the island. It wasn't long before researchers found something important. They found the remains of monasteries that dated back to the 6th century, and later what they thought was a small pearling village. This alone was a significant find, as it dates back to an important historical period for the region. But archaeologists at the time didn't realize the full extent of what they had uncovered. More excavation work was done. At first, it was believed that the village served the monastery. Now, archaeologists realized this was part of a much larger city. Residential buildings packed around narrow streets, suggesting it was densely populated. The remains of pottery and fish bones showed that there was an extensive trade network, which may have connected the city to Iraq, Iran, and as far away as India. Just like the lost city of Tuam, the settlement dates back to the 6th century and showed signs of being badly hit by the plague. Archaeologists located a mass grave, but none of the remains showed any signs of physical violence. It was likely these were the victims of the disease that swept through the Mediterranean and Near East regions. Archaeologists admitted they hadn't found anything that specifically included the name Tuam, but they still believed this was the lost city. Number 3. It was described as one of the oldest cold cases in colonial American history. Ever since his skeleton was uncovered in 1996, archaeologists and historians have tried to solve the mystery of who JR-102C was and who took his life. Many theories were put forward before the mystery was finally solved. The remains were located in 1996. 2 years earlier, the Jamestown Rediscovery Project had been launched to try to locate the remains of the original Jamestown fort. Many feared that it had been washed away by the James River. But in 1996, the remains of the fort were located and excavation work began. Among the many discoveries uncovered were the remains of a man who had become known as JR-102C. There was a cemetery located within the walls of the fort, but JR had been buried apart from the rest. His gravesite was found under an old roadbed, near only one other grave. He'd been buried in a coffin and wrapped in a shroud which had disintegrated long ago. But most interesting was the figure's legs. A lead bullet was still found embedded in the shattered leg, just below the knee. There was no sign of any healing, and the leg was still twisted. It was obvious that this is what had claimed JR's life. It may have only been a matter of hours after he was struck by the bullet before he passed away. It was long after the discovery that speculation began about who this mysterious person was and who took his life. Whoever JR was, he'd passed away roughly 400 years earlier, and it seemed unlikely that this case would ever be solved. But there were some records from early in Jamestown's existence that offered some clues. Early on, archaeologists thought JR had passed away early in the life of the colony. JR had been buried in a coffin, and his bones suggested he'd been relatively healthy when he passed away. Not long after the fort was established, the colonists at Jamestown began to struggle. Their supplies dwindled, and a lack of food and water became a major problem for the colonists. As JR showed no signs of these struggles, it was assumed he'd passed away before this point. Some thought he may have been an individual named Stephen Calthrop, who'd been one of the original colonists. He passed away just 3 months after they arrived in Jamestown, but no cause was ever recorded. Archaeologists believe he may have joined John Smith in his mutiny against the expedition leader. As a noble, Calthrop wasn't punished at the time, but it seemed to historians that he may have paid the price later on. But new research casts doubt on the early assumptions. Rather than being an early grave, researchers believed that JR had passed away after the struggles and the starving times. They not only had a name for JR, but also the person who took his life. George Harrison was a 19-year-old colonist when he lost his life after a duel. He'd faced a man named Richard Stevens in the duel. Stevens went on to become a court commissioner and was a critic of the Virginia governor. Details about what the duel was about didn't survive. The angle at which the bullet entered Harrison's leg matches the stance he would have taken for the duel. One aspect that puzzled historians was the fact that it was a combat round rather than something more traditional for a duel. They theorized that Stevens may have been acting less than honorably. Number 2. Henry Avery was one of the first pirates to gain infamy around the world. His fame and legend survived, in part because the so-called Pirate King was never captured, but his actual fate has remained a mystery for centuries. A recently uncovered letter from someone calling themselves Avery the Pirate might have finally solved that mystery. Avery's piracy began in 1694. He was part of a group of sailors working for a company helping Spanish ships in the West Indies. There were problems with payments and lengthy delays in Spain. Eventually, about 25 men decided to mutiny. Avery was chosen as the leader. A ship named the Charles II was stolen and renamed the Fancy. With Avery as captain, the Fancy was sailed to the Indian Ocean where the crew harassed merchants and fellow pirates alike. Avery had already made a name for himself as a fearsome pirate when he pulled off the heist that would make him famous. The target was a ship named Ganj-e-Sawai. It was part of a convoy owned by the Mughal emperor and was loaded with precious gems and treasures. Despite the ship being well armed and Avery being outnumbered, the pirates were able to take over. What followed was a horrific experience for all the passengers of the Ganj-e-Sawai. Over the course of several days, the pirates extracted hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of treasure, including gold, silver, and jewels. The heist today would have been worth around $90 million. News of Avery's crime spread quickly. A worldwide manhunt began, but Avery managed to slip through the net. He and his crew traveled to the island of New Providence in the Bahamas. The governor there was bribable and allowed the crew of the Fancy to come ashore. Gradually, the crew went their separate ways. By the time the English caught up with the Fancy, most of the crew had disappeared. Some were arrested, but Avery was not one of them. Avery remained one of the most wanted men in the world. The reward money for capturing him was extremely high, but it was never claimed. What happened to Avery has remained a mystery, but researchers believe they have found an answer. Shipwreck hunters going through the Scottish Records Office found a letter that had caught their eyes. It had allegedly come from someone calling themselves Avery the Pirate. Much of the letter was written in code, And even when it was made public in 2024, some of that code hadn't been deciphered. But this only helped to convince researchers that it was real. Henry Avery had taken a part in and joined a spy ring in England. This spy ring included the likes of writer Daniel Defoe, who had created numerical code used by spies of William III. Also in the ring was the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Tennyson. The letter was addressed to a man named Reverend James Richardson, who worked as a librarian at an institute Tennyson had set up. Details like the address that the letter was sent to and instructions for the return mail helped to convince researchers this wasn't some kind of forgery. Avery the Pirate's letter was sent in 1700, years after Avery's famous disappearance. It doesn't actually go into any details about what the writer was doing, or at least not any that can be understood today. The letter talks about upcoming meetings between people who are only denoted by numbers. It's impossible for modern researchers to know who these numbers represent, but researchers did note that this was something that spies and diplomats in England at that time were doing. While the letter appears to be genuine, it's not yet clear if the pen name, Avery the Pirate, was actually Henry Avery. For some, more corroborating evidence would be needed to call this mystery truly solved. Number 1. It was June 14, 1940. The Soviet Union was preparing to occupy the Baltic states, including Estonia. There was already an unofficial blockade of ships and planes leaving the country. Despite this, a Finnish passenger plane attempted to make the trip from Tallinn to Helsinki, but it would never make it home. It didn't take long for the fate of the Kaleva and her passengers to be discovered, but over 60 years would pass before the mystery of the plane's location was solved. The Kaleva was a Junkers Ju-52 plane operated by the Finnish state airline Aero Oy. Aero Oy had struggled to operate during the war with the Soviet Union, but an armistice had been negotiated in March of that year, and regular flights were back underway. On the surface, the flight from Tallinn to Helsinki was one of these regular flights, but there was a general unease in Estonia, and people were trying to get out. Earlier that day, U.S. diplomatic courier Henry W. Enfield Jr. had flown in to evacuate sensitive diplomatic pouches. He was now making his way back out of the country, along with 6 other passengers. These were 2 German businessmen, 2 French embassy couriers, 1 Swede, and a Finnish-born Estonian woman. She was described as the only real passenger aboard the flight. Also aboard were just 2 crew members, the pilot and the wireless operator. The plane took off without issue just before 3 p.m. The crew contacted Helsinki at 3:05. Nothing seemed to be wrong, but when Helsinki tried to contact the plane again at 3:06, they received no response. The Kaleva had been attacked by 2 Soviet planes while over the Baltic Sea. The incident was witnessed by Estonian fishermen who watched the Soviet planes open fire on the defenseless civilian aircraft. Within moments, it caught fire and came down into the water. Flotsam was rescued by the fishermen. This allegedly included diplomatic pouches which floated to the surface. There were unfortunately no survivors anywhere to be seen. 40 minutes after the crash, another group arrived at the scene. It was a Soviet submarine that had been 5 miles away from the crash. According to the fishermen, they'd also searched the area and confiscated mail and valuables that the fishermen had collected. The submarine was also reported by a Finnish pilot who'd been sent to investigate the crash. It was obvious what had happened, but Finland did not want to incur the wrath of the Soviet Union when it was at its most powerful. The official reports simply state that the mysterious crash was caused by an external factor. It wasn't until years later that the truth came out. In the US, the news was overshadowed by the German occupation of Paris, but after the war, the focus returned to the downing of the Kaleva. Enfield was acknowledged as one of the first US casualties of the war, and finding the wreckage was important to both the US and Estonia. Many searches took place. There was a fear that the wreckage had been destroyed by the USSR, sometime during its occupation of the Baltic states. In 2008, an extensive search using underwater autonomous vehicles turned up no clues in the search for the missing plane. But in June of 2024, an Estonian diving and salvage team announced it had discovered the wreckage. The debris was scattered over a field that spanned an area of up to 100 square meters. but certain parts were identifiable as coming from the Ju-52 plane. The team hopes to do more work to create 3D images of the wreck and possibly locate any cargo or human remains that still lie within it. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.